For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. This is the word of the Lord.
Morning, first service. First service of the year. And good to be here. I'm going to start a 4-week series on the vision of our church. And I usually like to do this at the beginning of the year, but perhaps no year is it more appropriate than this year, when San Jose New Hope is going to take our congregation and make it the first church plant it's ever done. You know that our church has never done a church plant in 30 plus years. We will be the first, and that's an exciting, a little scary, but an amazing thing. And so it's good and appropriate that we really kind of like dig down into our hearts and replant into our hearts the most important things that we stand for. And this first message, if you haven't, let me just show it to you here. I don't know if you never even noticed this, but at the top of our bulletin, we have this little tagline that says, "A Jesus-centered family crossing generations and cultures." A Jesus-centered family crossing generations and cultures. And today I'm going to talk about one of the core portions of what we stand for here in this church, which is the gospel crossing cultures. The gospel crossing cultures. Theoretically, in principle, every church should be a church where they take the gospel and they are willing to take it and cross into other cultures. And any good Bible-believing church will do this by sending missionaries to other countries. But in a church like this, a church with many immigrants and multi-generations, we must learn how to cross cultures right inside our own building, right inside our very own community. But even more so, we have to learn how to cross cultures because of the nature of this city. This is not a mono-ethnic, monocultural city. It isn't. If you live in this, you don't even need to live here very long. You just visit. And you just roam about the city, and you would see it's filled with people literally from the other side of the globe. And by the way, that issue is not just something that's a geographical issue, or like it's one culture inside this room, another culture inside, in that room over there, down the hallway. That's not all that's going on. The question of multiple cultures is not only, in one side of town, this area that we call Little Saigon of San Jose, right? Or Koreatown of San Jose. It's also right inside of you. It's right inside of me. It's inside of the very individual. Now, I actually gave a variation of this message to the Korean-speaking congregation this Wednesday to kick off this new year. Pastor David Cho of the Korean-speaking ministry, he asked all the English-speaking pastors to speak in their Wednesday night service. We're going to do this for the first 8 weeks. And he asked me to go first, and that was this past Wednesday. And I gave a variation of this message to them. And today I'm pleased to give it to you, although simply because you're not the KM, the message has got to be different, okay? But I'm going to cover some of the same material in this message today in 3 parts. Part 1, cultural amphibians. It's a little word that I came up with for the kind of people that we have in this congregation and the kind of people that I believe that our church is intended to reach. Right? Cultural amphibians. Part 2, communal homelessness and the church as Jesus-centered family. That's what our motto, our vision is about, that we are a Jesus-centered family that has a mission to take the gospel and cross cultures and generations. But there is a huge blessing with cultural amphibians. Well, you guys are like, well, what are you talking about, Pastor Sis? I'll tell you in just a moment, all right? But there's also deep weakness. And that weakness is that they're communally homeless. All right? They often end up being homeless. That's what part 2 is about. And part 3 is the heart of whatever it takes. There's a beautiful portion in this scripture about how to reach people like this. And there's a particular heart. And I call it the heart of whatever it takes. So let's get into this message, part 1. Cultural amphibians. And this is the way I present it actually to the cam, and I'll do this for you too. Do you guys know what this is? You guys know what this is? It's a really tasty and really bad for you treat. Okay? They say that you could put this on the shelf for like years and years, and then you could eat it and it'll still be okay. You may not be okay because the preservatives inside this thing are so bad that you can literally throw it up on the shelf and it won't rot or anything for a long time. Now it's a treat, but let me tell you kind of a little bit of a painful story. When I was a teenager, I went to, for those of you who don't know, I went to a local high school here called Saratoga High School. And at the time, Saratoga High School was about 95% white. That might actually be low. It may have been 98% white. All right. But in other words, it was a largely white high school. And I grew up here in the United States. My family immigrated to the U.S. when I was 5 years old, and we bounced around the Bay Area. Every place I lived in the Bay Area, it didn't feel white to me. Right? Well, first of all, the first neighborhood we lived in was Richmond, and it was 98% black. That was the first school I went to. All my friends were black. Okay, and so we bounced around, and we moved to San Jose, and we lived in South San Jose, which was white, but it was increasingly Mexican, and the Vietnamese had just started moving into the neighborhood. This is the early '80s. And then we went to East San Jose, and that was even more Mexican, and even more Vietnamese were moving into the neighborhood. And then in 9th grade, we moved to Saratoga, and then it was like 98% white. And that's when I finally had culture shock. Isn't that kind of interesting? Right? That's kind of what it was like for me in 9th grade. And I had a couple of good friends, and they were Korean, actually, Korean American. And there's the one guy, he was Indian. He was like the only Indian guy that we knew in our class. That's what it was like. I mean, today, Saratoga High School is probably 60% Asian, lots of Chinese and Indians, but that's not what it was like back then. And there was an insult that came about that said, oh, you're not like a real Korean. Huh. You are, actually, we didn't use this term. The term that's used today is Twinkie. That's the term that we use this today. But back then we used a different term. We use this. You a banana. But you guys understand what this is, right? And of course, I had to explain this to the Korean-speaking congregation because they were like looking at me like I was strange. And well, what's a banana or a Twinkie? Here I brought the visual. Don't ask me for any more because I gave them all away. After this sermon, one of the elders came up to me and said, hey, let me have one of those. And when one of your elders asks for a Twinkie, you're like, sure. Even though I said in the message, don't eat this because this is bad for you, right? But you guys know what this is, right? It's yellow on the outside, but it's white on the inside. Yellow on the outside, but white on the inside. And, I'm 15, 16. And that's not a fun thing for somebody to call you when you're, in the middle of your teenage years and you don't know who you are. I mean, that's the thing that happens when you're in the middle of your teenage years. You don't quite know who you are. It's in formation. And maybe for the first time, I don't know if it was the first time, but but for the first time in the most sharp way, in a very cutting and a hurtful way. Right? I had to wrestle with this question: am I a Korean? Or am I an American? But even then, think about this. Even then, I started having questions. Being an American, does that mean you're white? I mean, I knew I was more American, or becoming pretty American. I'll tell you an interesting story. Growing up, I always saw myself as a Korean. But after my sophomore year of high school, my parents sent my brother and I to visit Korea for the first time. It was exciting. We'd never seen, we saw Korea. I still have memories of Korea when we left when I was 5 years old. But 16, I was thinking, what are Korean girls like? Yeah, this is going to be cool. All right? And so I have some Chinese friends, and they have this thing where you go to Taiwan, and they have a name for it. They call it Love Boat. Okay, that's what they call it. Really what you do is for 2 weeks or a month or whatever it is, you travel around the country, and you get to see the motherland. The Korean Americans don't call it Love Boat, but it's basically the same thing. It's like a national program. It's literally run by the Korean government, and it's sort of like, come to Korea, all you Koreans who went and lived in other countries, most of them in the United States. I met a Korean kid from Brazil, even from Germany. It was a Korean German. It was really weird. He couldn't really speak English very well, so we actually had to try to speak to each other in Korean, and that was really not very helpful. I would use my broken German because I was taking German, and then his English wasn't very good, and we would have to try to. That was really weird. But the Chinese guys call it Love Boat because, you pick up a girlfriend for 2 weeks and then you forget about her after you go back to the home country. But I did this, and I spent that summer in Korea. And I'll tell you this interesting story. I was in a shop looking for music. This gives you an idea how old I was. It wasn't CDs. It was cassettes. Okay. So I walk into a store. And it's really like the wall is filled with cassettes. Over here's the pop section. They had a Korean pop section. They had an American pop section. And this shows you kind of the nerd I was. I was on the classical music side, okay? Right? And I was looking at the classical music side, and I hadn't said a word. I walked into the store, and I was just looking at the music up and down. I literally had said nothing. There's a guy, the storekeeper, he's sitting there behind his counter. And there's music in the background because, in a music store, of course, you're going to hear music. But otherwise, literally, nobody said anything. I'm the only guy in the store. And the guy goes, and he says in Korean, when did your family go to America? When did your family go to America? I was going how did you know I was American? I hadn't said anything. He couldn't hear a bad Korean accent or anything like that. Just somehow, by the way I dressed, I didn't think I dressed like an American. Somehow, by the way I walked, he picked up that I was an American. Stuff like that happened throughout that whole summer. And so when I came back to the U.S., and now I'm having this conversation with my Korean American friend, and they're calling me a banana, or we're talking about whether who and so is a banana. This guy's a banana, but this guy's not. And I'm questioning this about myself. I have this, I don't know, I guess it's this deep problem. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about identity. And, among my Chinese friends, so in the Korean American world, I am what they call, and many of you are what they call second generation Korean American. Like, they call it Isai, it literally means second gen, right? And so that means the first generation is like Korean, they're by blood. But if you cut them open, the joke I made is, a Korean flag comes spilling out. And then, the Korean national anthem, starts to sing out of the heart, right? But what comes out of the second generation Korean American is on the face, they're Korean, and by blood, they're Korean. But if you cut them open, what cultures come spilling out? The stars and stripes come out. And you start hearing, oh, say, can you, it starts coming out, right? Because that's what's in us. That's what I mean by cultural amphibian. This is an identity issue, and in many ways, even a crisis that many, many Americans, especially non-white Americans, especially immigrant Americans, face. The Chinese guys, they call their second generation. The reason they don't call them second generation is because they have a third and a fourth and a fifth generation that all have the same issue, and they call them ABCs, American-born Chinese. When I was in college, I read one of my literature classes. I read a book about Mexico Texans. And when in the middle of reading this book, I was thinking, I totally understand this issue. It is the issue of cultural amphibians. Now, what do I mean by culture? That's the term I'm using. What's a cultural amphibian? You guys know what an amphibian is, right? I mean, do you remember, your biology when you're an amphibian is, it's not a reptile and it's not a fish. A fish is like a cold-blooded animal that swims in the water. That's its environment. And what's a reptile? It's a cold-blooded animal that is on land, like a lizard. But then you have this odd thing called like a frog. And a frog, at one point of his life, has gills. And that means it can be in the water, and that's its native environment. But it can also be on land. That's also its native environment. That's the power of the frog. It can actually be in two worlds. It actually can be at home in two worlds. And that is what, that's the way I look at you guys. That's the way I look at second generation immigrant Americans, or for Chinese folks, or Mexicans. Mexicans are also third and fourth and fifth generation. But because they're fourth generation Mexican American or third generation Chinese American, they don't, there is a problem inside our society, and that is the problem of race. I've talked about this a few times, but I try not to touch too much. It's a raw and painful problem. That if you are an American, just like that storekeeper, that music storekeeper in Seoul saw me as, are you white? If you take on kind of like individual American, and I'm American and I love my flag, and you have, you have this kind of rugged individualism, are you white? And that's what it feels like to an Asian who is from another part of the world, or to, they don't have this powerfully individualistic culture. And if you practice something more like this individualism, they see you as something like, you seem like a white American. That's what it's like. But in principle, America is not a white country, but that is the Anglo culture. It's not the German, not the Italian, the Anglo culture of white America. It is the dominant culture. It is the culture that has kind of like tried to absorb many, many other cultures. But that that, the old word, it's considered a bad word today, is assimilation. That process where you become Americanized, it's not that easy, is it? Now, let's stop for a moment. You're like, Pastor, you're supposed to teach the Bible. Why are you talking about all this culture stuff? Come on, teach us the Bible. You're supposed to preach the Bible. It's in the Bible. It's absolutely in the Bible. Here it is, verse 20. Verse 20. Here is how Paul puts it. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law. I won't try to explain to you all that too much, but under the law, that means under the Torah, under the Jewish law. I became as one kind of like a guy under the Jewish law, that I might win those, that I might win Jews. And then you go verse 21. Well, let's just stop for a moment. Then we ask you this question. Isn't it weird that Paul would say, to the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews? It's weird because isn't Paul a Jew? So why would a Jew say, I became one as a Jew, like a Jew, to win Jews? That's really weird. Paul, newsflash, you're Jewish. What are you talking about, man? Now let's go to verse 21. Verse 21. To those outside the law, to those outside the Torah, those outside the Mosaic Jewish law. That's, in other words, to the Gentiles. All the Gentiles, all the people who are not Jews, those are the people outside the law. And particularly here, the culture of the time, the dominant culture was a Hellenistic culture or a Greek culture. They spoke Greek, right? To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law. I'm not outside the law of God, he says, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. You know what Paul's saying? Now, just a moment. Paul is ethnically, by blood, he's Jewish, 100% Jewish. But culturally, you know that Paul did not grow up in Palestine. He did not grow up in Israel. He didn't grow up speaking Aramaic. He did probably study Hebrew. There's quite strong evidence that Paul's Hebrew is quite good. But he didn't grow up speaking Aramaic. Heck, as far as we know, maybe he couldn't speak it. That is the language Jesus spoke. That is the language that Peter and James and John, all those other disciples that followed Jesus, they spoke Aramaic. It's a Hebrew dialect of the time, right? But Paul grew up in Tarsus. And he went to Tarsus Elementary School and Tarsus High School, and then he went to Tarsus University. He went to Greek University. And he studied the great Greek philosophers. He got a first-rate Greek education. And doesn't that seem very... So if you cut Paul open, yeah, he's Jewish, but a whole lot of Greek culture comes spilling out of him. So when Paul is saying to the Jews, I became as a Jew, and to the Greeks, I became as a Greek, you know what he's talking? He's talking about, he could say I'm a second-gen Jewish Greek. It's kind of like, that'd be like the way he would put it. If I were to say, Paul, you know what this is? He would look at it like, what is this? Is this food? I was like, that's not what we're talking about. It's yellow on the outside and white on the inside. You understand that identity issue? And he'd look at me and he goes, of course I know what a Twinkie is. I am one. Except I'm Jewish on the outside and Greek on the inside. There is this issue. The great thing, first I'm going to talk about the great thing about cultural amphibians, you guys. All right? Then in part 2, I'm going to talk about the hard thing about it. But let's talk about the great thing. The great thing is, since you're an amphibian, you could be in the water and you could swim. think about it. If you take, we have this term, it's this term that I grew up with, and we called it FOB, fob, fresh off the boat. In Korean, fresh off the biengi, right? Right? And if you are a fob, fresh off the boat, and you throw that person right into the middle of white America, will they be okay? I don't think they'll be okay. First of all, they're like, especially if you threw them into the middle of like Kansas or like Oakland or someplace, Well, you know what that's like? That's like throwing a lizard into the water. Take a lizard and just throw them into the pond. What happens? They drown. That's how people feel when you like throw yourself into a culture that you're an alien into. Just how about you? You and I as an American, we'll just drop you into the middle of Ghana. Did you make it, buddy? You're like, well, I'm not really suited for this environment. Right. But an amphibian can swim. An amphibian can swim. A frog, take him off the land, throw him into the water, and he'll be fine. That's what you and I are. That's what Paul is. He can swim. But you don't necessarily always swim great. That's the interesting part of it. I mean, I don't know what, if you were to throw some number, what part of me is Korean? I don't know. 25% of me is Korean. If you're like, look at me culturally, what the heck am I? 25% of me is Korean. I think if you ever like try to like guess what I would say, I'm probably like 25% Korean and like, 70%, American and 5% some other weird miscellaneous, like partially Latino or something. Okay? But that 25% that's Korean, that means when I'm around Koreans, you know what that means? That means I can swim. I mean, so can many of you. And then if you throw me into a culture that's something more like Korean culture, like some other Asian culture around like Chinese folks, or by the way, one of our missionaries, he works with Middle Easterners, and he said that when he went to missionary training, that was in an all-white circle inside of his denomination, he said he had culture shock. But then he went overseas into a Middle Eastern culture that he was, seeking to reach. He was like, oh, I was at home. It was interesting. Why? Because they have the same kind of like hierarchical relationship patterns as Asians. And so he's Asian, he looks different than them, but he was at home because he could swim. You get it? Because he could swim in that culture. And then you walk into American culture and, well, we can swim in this culture. That's the great power of the culture amphibians. And when many of the first generation folks in this church, and probably your parents and so forth, look at you, they just think, wow, we're in America and I swim very, very badly. I almost drowned those first few years when we came to America. And I felt like I was drowning so much that I had to go find some of my own. So then they, go find a little pond, a little stretch of land that's where they can be comfortable. But then when they look at us, they're like, you could just swim in this place. It just belongs to you, doesn't it? So that's part one, cultural amphibians. And that's Paul. Paul, this is why God called Paul to be an apostle. Jesus literally called him. And Jesus called the other guys. But then when the gospel had to go to the Greeks, could he call Peter? Peter, go to the... He did actually say, no, actually they belong to you too. The whole portion in the book of Acts. But Peter wasn't the one sent to preach the gospel to the Greeks. He sent a guy who had a Greek heart to preach the gospel to the Greeks. That's Paul. Let's go to part two. The great power of the amphibian is you can be on the land and you can swim in the water. You can walk into Like I could probably, be in certain cultures more comfortably than, and you guys know this is true. If I get one of my white friends and we walk into a Chinese church, who's going to be more comfortable? I'm not Chinese, but that guy is truly, he's like a fish out of water. He's like going to flop around and he's going to feel like, without you, I'll probably feel like I could like die out here, like drown out here, right? Drown in the oxygen. Because that's what fish are doing. They're drowning in the air oxygen, right? But what is the hard part? So part 2 is communal homelessness. The advantage is I can jump into the water and I can swim, or I can go into the land and I can live. But then human beings aren't frogs. Human beings aren't frogs. Human beings are deeply communal. You know that we're a deeply communal species? We need a people. We need belonging. We have a word for it. We need a home. You can live in a house, and if nobody loves you inside that house, it's not a home. You get it? You understand the difference? Home is where you go, and the people know you, and you belong, and they love you. And this is the problem of so many second-generation immigrants, or third, or even third or fourth. They have the power of being able to go into about 2 worlds. But when you ask them what is their home, they have that same feeling I had when I was 16 years old and one of my friends accused me of being a banana. What's my home? I've been an EM pastor, this thing that we call it in our world, EM, English Ministry Pastor, for many, many years. And I am the pastor of these communally homeless people. That's how God has called me to be. That's how I see it. You know what this congregation's for? It's for people who feel lost in this world, in this society. As I've been thinking about this message, I've literally been thinking about this message for weeks. I've been thinking, and of course, I've been thinking about this problem for years. In some ways, first-generation Korean Americans who are just really Koreans, they're barely Americans. If they're American, they're not very American. My dad's a Korean American, but man, he's not very American. But it's just easier, and they have huge advantages. They're in there when they walk into, when Koreans walk into this building, you know how they feel? They feel like they're at home. But when the 14-year-old kid who worships in the next room, or when the 20-year-old, 19-year-old college student walks in this building, maybe they feel at home. Maybe. And probably they don't. When Pastor David Cho on the Korean-speaking side came into our church, he had this conversation with me and Frank, Pastor Young, Joe, and he asked this question: what percentage of our high school graduates still go to church after they leave our church and go off to college? And we looked at him and said, we're not quite sure, maybe 50%. You know what his reaction to that was? Oh, whoa, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Think about that. 1 out of 2 will go to church or a Christian fellowship after they leave and graduate from high school. 1 out of 2. And Pastor David Cho thought that was a good percentage. You know what? You know why he thinks that's a good percentage? Because he understands the Twinkie problem. Actually, if you go to churches all around the country, you know what the percentage is of those who still follow Jesus after they come out of churches like this, immigrant church? It's probably something more like 25, maybe 30%. So when we told Pastor Cho, our church is probably running 50%, he was like, that's good. We're ahead of the curve. But think about how painful that must be, that if 50% is good, 50% is bad. If you got a 50% on a test in school, you would fail. Do you think 50% is good before Jesus? I don't think so. And when I look at our youth, when I look at our college students, I can't wait till they're sitting here in the next service. I'm going to look straight into their face and I want to look at you. Are you going to church? And they're going to sit there and go, not really, Pastor. And you know why they don't go? Because you can't just believe in Jesus by yourself. There's no such thing as being a lone ranger. When you believe in Jesus, it's a we activity. When you believe in Jesus, Jesus offers you a home. And you know what it is? It's the church. In America, people think that church is religion, and religion is something you shop for. So we treat religion sort of the way we treat, like, I shop at Lucky's, or I shop at Safeway Supermarket. That's the chain I prefer. Or some of you prefer to shop at, like, a Hanguk Market or something like that, or Ranch 99, right? Those are the other supermarket chains in our city. But it's not if the supermarket is a temple to, like, really low-cost variety of food, some people think the church is just a temple of religion. That's a place I go do religion. But that's not really what it is. The church is really a home. It's a family. It's a forever family. And what if you take a second-generation immigrant son or daughter, and inside, I don't belong here nor there. I guess I don't know anywhere I belong. And then they go off, and they're like, I kind of believe in Jesus. But then they may even try a couple of churches, but they feel really uncomfortable there. You're supposed to, I can't just go to a Korean church. This gets so interesting. Do you know that we have members, I don't know, Frank has told me these stories. We have young people who have come out of our church, and then they go to some Korean American church, and they go into an English-speaking congregation like this, but their balance of culture is just a little different than ours. Their English-speaking congregation is like more thickly Korean. It's like, if our congregation, if your lead pastor is more like 25% Korean and mostly American, but then you go into that congregation and that guy feels more like 60% Korean and 40% American, guess what? You're not going to feel like that guy fits you. And so we're even losing. There are guys are going to, our young people are going to some church in a congregation like this, and then they don't stick because they don't feel like they belong. Isn't that crazy? It's happening. Now, I'm going to tell you something that I told the Korean-speaking congregation. This is what I called it. I called it the Yeji test. I have a name for this. I called it the Yeji test. So, you guys know who Yeji is. Yeji is the daughter of our beloved Ron and Jane. And this is how I look at my calling, and when I look at you, I think of people like Ron and Jane. Now, of course, I love Ron and Jane because God has called me to love them, but now I love them because you start loving a person, you don't just love them because you're supposed to, because you actually love them, right? And then, but Jane is a daughter of this church. She's probably she is a lot more Korean than me. She goes off to the East Coast, go to college, graduates college. Now, she understands that she's a lot more Korean. Shouldn't she have married a Korean guy who speaks really good Korean? No, that's not what she does. She goes and finds this really tall, good-looking dude who's from the Philippines, or at least his parents are. He's actually from Hawaii. I didn't know this, but Ron's apparently not full-on Filipino either, right? And then Ron comes to San Jose, and he gets saved in our church, gets baptized in our church, and they get married. And then they have a beautiful daughter. And they name her Yeji. Awesome name. For those of you who don't know, Yeji is Korean for the wisdom of Jesus. Awesome name, all right? And now you have this really cute girl who inside of her, she's even more amphibious than us. You got some Filipino, you got some Korean, and of course, she's all American, but not white American. And here's what I mean by the Yeji test. So like mom, she grows up, goes off to college on the East Coast, and meets some tall, good-looking dude. So when she's 18, you know what my question mark is? Will she have found a home in her church? Will she love Jesus so deeply? It's not a question of whether she'll go to church. She has to go find her family when she's 18. Will that happen? And then when she's 25 and she meets some tall, good-looking dude and brings him home to San Jose on vacation, and then she goes, Pastor SooSang, this is my boyfriend. I'm going to marry him. Will you marry us? Just like Jane said to me, right? And then I take a look at this guy and find out that his dad is Mexican. He's a Mexico-Texan. And his mom is Chinese. She's third generation ABC from New Jersey. Got a Mexico-Texan who married an ABC from New Jersey. And then this young man, the fiance and future husband of Yeji, comes into our church. Will he find a home? When he comes into our church, can we embrace him? Can we love him? And he can say, oh, this is my home. It's my family. That's what our church is about. You want to know what our church is going to be? We're going to plant this church. And when we say that we are a Jesus-centered family, that's the church. Not a Korean-centered family, not even an American-centered family, but a family centered on Christ. That's our church. And a family centered on Christ can reach the amphibians. It can cross culture right inside of our heart. That's the kind of church that we are. And when we plant this church, we're going to reach Yeji's and all her friends, just like we want to reach your friends. Now let me close this message. There is a verse, verse 22, verse 22. It goes like this, right? To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. You know what that means? There's many, many layers of meaning on this, but here's what it means. If you walk into, at this time, most of the people who had first become Christians, you know that? They were Jewish. They were Jewish. And so if you were Greek in culture and you walked into the church, many of them would be culturally Jewish, and they would go, oh, but I'm like Cyprian. And I speak mostly Greek, and they're trying to speak Greek here, but everybody here seems to be ethnically Jewish. Do I belong? And the person who was the minority, you know what they would feel? I'm weak. They would feel weak. Or flip it around. Let's say a guy was from Israel, but then he moves to Rome, because that happened back then too. He's a Jew. And they did global capitalism back then too, so he moves to Rome. And then he goes into church, the Church of Rome. You know, the letter to the Romans was a letter to the Church of Rome. It's the only church. I believe in Jesus as my Messiah. Walks in, nobody's Jewish here. There's like, this church has 200 people and 5 Jews. Everybody is Italian. Most of the people. Then the guy who's Jewish would feel in this community, I am weak. And you know what Paul's saying? To the weak, I became weak, Why? That I might win the weak. You guys know what the EM pastor is? To the weak, I became weak. In this community, that's how it feels. Right? But there's a lot of people who feel weak and they're homeless out there. Will you join me and to the weak become weak to win the weak? I have become all things to all people that by all means, I might save some. All things to all people that by all means, there's the word, I had to study a lot of, I gave that sermon, by the way, in Korean, in very bad, broken Konglish. It was hard. But in Korean, the word there, by all means, is translated amucho록. Right? And I think that translation is something like this: by whatever it takes. And Paul said, when I meet a Jew, I'll be weak with him. If he's in Rome, he's going to feel weak. And when I meet a Greek in Israel, I'll be weak with him. When he's in Israel, he's going to feel weak. And whatever it takes, I will go and meet him in his weakness. So that the gospel crosses into that weakness of culture to reach them. But just stop there for a moment. Doesn't that sound a lot like somebody else? Is Paul the only person who could say to the weak, I became weak, so I might win the weak? And that by all means, by whatever it takes, so that I might save some. I offered this imaginary conversation to the Korean-speaking congregation. So there was a person, he had a conversation with his father. And his father said something like this: I want you to go over there into that foreign culture and go live among those people and do whatever it takes, all means, and make yourself weak so you can save some of them. And the son said, no, Dad, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. Those people are liars and fakes and cheaters. Look at that culture. It is a gross, disgusting culture. Why would I want to go be among those people and go become one of them? Is that what he said? You know who I'm talking about, right? Is that what he said? Of course that's not what he said. The son said, I will go do it, whatever it takes. And the father said to him, whatever it takes? What if it takes a cross? Would you be willing to be nailed on the cross and spill your blood so you could wash them and be one of them? And the son said, yes, whatever it takes. That's the heart that I want our church to have. There was a son who crossed over into our culture to become one of us, and he had a heart of whatever it takes. And he sent to Paul to go reach Greeks, the weak people of his day. And today, he sends us. We are the 21st century amphibians, Pauls, to reach the weak people, the homelessly weak of our time. Would you receive the heart of Christ? And in this church, that we would have a church of whatever it takes. To the weak, I will become weak. To win them for Jesus. Let's pray.